Welcome to the show. Today I have Patrick Koller on the show, and he's the founder and CEO of Matchspace. And before Matchspace, Patrick has been involved as Chief Marketing, Product Management, and Chief Digital Innovation Officer at Franke, and he's been involved at several leading brands in senior leadership positions before that. And I'm super excited to have you here today and dive a little bit more into your story, talk a little bit about topics like transformation and change and leadership. And thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Danielle, for having me. My pleasure.
So let's dive right into your story. Tell us a little bit about who is Patrick, and maybe we can also talk about one or two defining moments that you feel really shaped you as a human being and as a leader.
Wow, that may take me way back, but maybe in short, I've just recently transitioned from a corporate career, last 16 years, working for leading brands, including Siemens, Select, and my former role as CMO, also with Franke, into now an entrepreneurial role as the founder and CEO of Matchspace. So that transition, I would say, is certainly a defining moment. Now leading a young, innovative startup with a very passion-driven idea. And what has really kind of been the red thread over the last, I would say, probably last 10 years, it started already back when I joined Siemens, was really to thrive, to create value and to innovate. That has been the common thread over, I'd say, at least the last 10 years. And that is also what drives me forward. It's to create value, to innovate, and with a lot of driven by passion.
Tell me a bit more about that. I'm super curious. When you say value, creating value, when we talk about passion and what drives you, talk to me a little bit more about that. What does value mean to you, and what is so fulfilling about creating value?
Well, I would say value, I define value in terms of creating something valuable for a customer. So always take a very customer-centric view and try to either solve a problem, a pain point, or to really elevate a certain experience. And that can be a much more smoother experience, can be solving a real pain point through an innovative solution or business model. And that's what's basically driven me over the last 10 years, and is obviously now center stage of everything we do at the Matchspace.
Maybe let's quickly do a turn into Matchspace, because I find it interesting. I know, maybe we're not talk forever about it, but I'm just super curious. First of all, what is it that got you into this idea or into this business? Sort of like what was your driver? And I guess value is going to be the answer, but still, I want to hear a little bit more. Like, what's most exciting to you about Matchspace?
Well, there's I would say probably two main driving forces. First of all, it was the realization that if I was 70 and 80 and I look back and I've never really tried to execute that idea that I had, and I've had several ideas before. I just always happened to have very interesting job opportunities that also it was a lot of fun and a steep learning curve, and it always excited me because it was a position that helps to transform an organization, to help to position it for the future, and to some degree always transform the business. But I deep in my heart, I knew that if I never do that, if I never actually give it a shot, that would probably be one of my biggest regrets if I'm 70 or 80. So I knew deep in my heart that it's not a question of whether I do it, but a question of when I do it. And I had several ideas. Like I've had many ideas in terms of, interesting enough, always around digital platforms, digital marketplaces. And Matchspace is basically the idea to help talented people, basically help people to turn their talent into a profession in the domain of mind, body, soul. And it started really with a pain point I had myself. I wanted to learn cello lessons. I've played piano for about over, I think, 14 years as a kid and teenager, and then eventually stopped because I didn't have time anymore. I couldn't fit it in a busy schedule. But now I wanted, or basically back in towards end of 2018, I wanted to pick up cello lessons. I just realized it's really hard to find anything that would fit in my busy schedule. That's either close to the workplace or home. That I would really be able to find a teacher that suits to my busy schedule. And then after more and more discussions, I find out I'm not the only one who shares that pain, and there's really a lack in the market to make that match between people that have that skill, people that have the talent, and people that want to develop that talent. And that was basically how the idea was born. And then over time, I just so far I couldn't find any reason why it shouldn't fly. So this is what basically how the idea was born.
I love that it's born out of a personal pain.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an incredibly interesting driver to launch something. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about innovation, human-centered innovation.
Mm-hmm.
So first question there is like, how important is the human in innovation? And either, if it's important, then why? And if it's not important, then why?
Innovation at the end of the day is done by humans. So human is always part of the equation, and innovation is done for other people, for other customers, partners, whoever is involved in a certain value chain. It's always people. Even AI is created by people for people. So it always has to be human centric, in my opinion.
Then why do we forget it so often? Like, I'm so, just super curious, because of course, to me, it makes sense too, right? And I would probably say to most people you talk, it's like, that makes sense. But then if you look at the reality, let's sell solutions first and then figure out what the problems are. I mean, we're living in 2020, but it's not like, something has dramatically changed, how we go about it. And it's still in some areas very solution driven in that sense. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about that. Why do you think that still is, or that is?
Well, I mean, maybe it's because human beings are not that straightforward and tend to be a bit complicated. If you ask 10 people, you get 10 different opinions. So one of the challenges is to actually then find out, okay, so what is it that we should do based on all this different feedback? Another challenge maybe is how innovations are organized in any corporation or company. Is it R&D that creates innovation? Is it marketing that basically comes up with new ideas? And depending on where or how you orchestrate your organization around innovation, you may have people that are more technical oriented, maybe more introverted, that are more focused in actually solving a problem technically. You may have people that more outward thinking, more market based, that really want to hear from the customer what they're struggling with. So I think it's probably a combination of both. It's how we organize innovation in a company, and in my experience, it's helpful if it's not just centered in one single department, but it's actually more cross-departmental or cross-functional effort, to really take on the different perspectives, not just a technical perspective on how to technically solve a certain problem, but actually also a more market-based or customer-centric view in terms of what is really the intrinsic motivation of a certain persona, buyer, or user, and how can we best or better solve it than what's currently in the market.
I really like the perspective of, obviously there's different kinds of people, different characteristics, and different people that focus on different things in an organization. And that's, of course, very valuable and also very challenging at the same time. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can dive into, a more like specific example, or maybe not an example, but some more experiences from your side when it comes to transformations. This is something that I'm very fascinated by, especially because of all the challenges that arise when an organization wants to transform from wherever to whatever. But transformation is always challenging on so many levels. Do you have an interesting story to tell there?
I'll probably have a few story questions. How much time do we have, Daniel?
Well, we have a couple of minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I have indeed been involved in larger business transformations already back, way back with Siemens when it was about to transform a product-oriented business unit or division into more solution-oriented company. But also recently in my previous role as CMO with Frankie, the challenge there was to help the organization evolve from a very product-oriented, machine manufacturer towards a more customer-centric solution provider. And I mean, those are fascinating transformations. It involves the entire company to kind of buy into a bigger vision and purpose of why there is a need to move in the first place, which it's basically, which really requires to generate some momentum to move the organization. And I find it's helpful if there is really common purpose that unites the organization behind that bigger ambition and goal. Because the natural inclination of a human being is not to change. It comes with pain. It comes with changing, with fear, losing, part of your function, or losing power within an organization, or just having to adopt new skills, or having to fish in new ponds, acquiring new customers in new markets. It's always related with a stretch or a bit of an effort that has to be made, and that requires energy to make that effort, and that's something that I find is most powerful if that energy is driven by a united passion and bigger idea.
Absolutely. I mean, that always very much helps, when people are actually lined up, so to say, under a common purpose, under a common. In your experience, what are some of the biggest challenges that come with transformations?
Well, it's I think one of the key challenges to actually how to engage everyone in a company that's international, based in different locations, different cultures. So you have the challenge of kind of engaging everyone despite different cultural backgrounds, despite language barriers potentially. In these days, it's more difficult if it's difficult, if you're not allowed, or if you shouldn't bring too many people together in the same room. Even more difficult if you have to do this all virtually, right? And then it has to be an ambition that is grand enough to kind of ignite some fire, but at the same time, it's crucial to break it down to achievable and feasible milestones, so that you can also celebrate small wins, and that you can cherish them as you move forward, so that the organization feels that it is moving. And if there's recognition from the outside, from customers or partners that basically cheer along the way, that obviously helps to also maintain the momentum. But it's a long stretch, something that is not done in 3 or 6 months. It requires it requires stamina and persistence. It requires a lot of communication, which is usually something that a lot of companies struggle with. If there's a change in any of the senior leadership positions, or CEO changes, or other key leadership positions change, that obviously is also not helping. So it requires a lot of pieces that need to fall in the right place, and also a clear program so that how you actually break that whole transformation down into how you slice the elephant in meaningful chunks that you can actually digest.
Talk to me a bit more about communication, because this is something I'm super interested in, because as you mentioned it as a challenge in transformations, and it's something that I hear so often. Like, first of all, how do you even communicate the transformation? Who do you communicate it to, and how do you communicate to each group? And then how do you ensure that people actually come on board? And is it like you set the vision, you communicate it, you get people on board? Do you get everybody on board in a co-creation effort from the beginning. I mean, there's so many complexities in all of that. How do you deal with the topic of communication when it comes to transformation?
There's probably not just one approach. I think there's various approaches. What I find critical is, first of all, that there's strong buy-in and strong commitment across the entire leadership, senior leadership team. If the organization feels that the senior leadership team is not aligned, then that obviously doesn't communicate a signal that that the senior leadership team is convinced. And I know it's rare that you can engage a whole organization to lead a team if it's not clear whether they're united or whether they're going. So it needs to be absolutely clear that the senior leadership team is united behind the larger ambition and vision. And then I think it's equally key to engage, ambassadors within the organization, team leaders that act as a role model and also closely, interlinked with the several teams, so that the teams themselves also have direct, team leader that can look up to, that leads the way, but can also help to bridge both ways. Helping cascading information down, but also feeding information up, so that for the senior leadership team, so that whether whether the organization is still engaged, or whether there's doubts, concerns, fears that you need to address. I mean, I think it's important to establish a dialogue. So it's not like a top-down communication of this is where we want to go. And we lead the way, but it's also a dialogue where people can voice any concerns, and they also feel that they have something to say and they can contribute to where the company is going or how they involve themselves in what capacity, shape, and form.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. Because when you talk about that, what just came up to me is the whole culture change, the change of mindset, and this is something very intangible in a sense, because I mean, we don't even have a common word for what is a culture in that sense, or a common understanding. Of course, everybody understands something a little bit different. And talking about culture change or mindset change, I mean, if we talk about changing a business model or changing the focus on services or solutions to the customer, or even the focus from services to solutions, I mean, any kind of change comes with the change of thinking, because it is a fundamentally different way of thinking. Like every business model has a different way of thinking. How do you how do you see it being done well, in a sense of everybody sort of needs to change their thinking? Does that start at the top and then drop ripples down, or is it something that comes from the outside, or is it something that where does it come from in a sense, and how do you effectively actually change people's mindsets, or is it even impossible to change people's mindsets?
Well, that's a tough one, and I'm also not sure if you really want to change a mindset. I think it's very difficult to want to change someone's mindset. I think it's important to appreciate and value that they are diversity and different perspectives, and maybe it's more a question of with what attitude do we bring that perspective into any subject. I think it's sheer impossible to assume that someone will change their mindset, but maybe they can appreciate that this is just one way of looking at a certain issue, and that there are other ways of looking at it, and maybe to moving the direction you want to move, it requires to embrace that a bit more an openness to to include other perspectives as well, or to if you want to transform your organization towards a more customer-centric organization, I mean, there are ways where you can help the organization to instill that customer centricity by actually giving it a voice. Now you can ask, okay, so how do you incorporate that voice? Do you need to have a chief customer officer that kind of manifestates that voice that kind of speaks for the market, or is it just make sure that everyone who has its touch points with customers has a seat on the table? I mean, there are different ways, and I think one size fits all. There's not one size fits all solution that applies to every company. It depends on company culture again, in terms of whether it's a very decentralized organization where it's very, you have different needs and pain points from customers based in different regions in the world, or but it's very centralized organization where all the product house is basically in one country, and then it's more like a sales organization that as a channel to the market. I think there's no one size fits all, but it's important that you if you want to make the transition, that you recognize you somehow have to incorporate it, either through a person, many departments, or through a process where at least have that voice of the customer that then is fed into any product development efforts, or also in your communication efforts.
It's what I find really interesting is what you said about mindset, and if you really want to change mindset, because you talked about then the appreciating the diversity and attitude. I find that really interesting because changing mindset in a sense is almost like changing somebody in their being a little bit. Like, I mean, that's maybe not either, it's impossible or it's not desired necessarily, right? And what you talked about with basically focusing on changing attitude, that allows you to keep the diversity of people thinking in different ways, people acting in different ways, people bringing different things to the table, but you align the attitude in a sense. So it allows you to keep the good in a sense, right? And it allows you to bring in what you need to make the transition work, or the transformation. I find that really interesting. Yeah,
I mean, obviously there are also situations where if there is destructive behavior to any kind of to any dialogue, then obviously sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes you do have to take some people out in order to make way for a new way of thinking or voicing the thoughts. So that usually is almost inevitable in any larger change, to kind of make ways for new ways of thinking. But again, also there, I think the strength in any decision making or as a transformation, it comes from diversity and not any monoculture. But if the monoculture, if there's too many windmills that fight the change, then obviously you have to ask yourself, how do you actually make way so that the change can actually proceed? So it's not, I wouldn't say it's all rosy and consensus oriented and just a matter of finding a way to moderate a certain process or discussion. Sometimes you just have to take some people out to bring in fresh, at least a different attitude or change the dynamics in discussions that facilitate or support change. Absolutely.
And that also brings me to the next topic, which basically leadership in these times of change, in times of transformation. I mean, I know there's no manual, there's no operations manual. I understand that. But in my experience, most leaders have some sort of ways of how they go about it, maybe with principles or some playbook in a sense, or some other philosophies, basically. How do you go about leading in times like that? Do you have a playbook? Do you have some principles, or how do you go about it?
Well, I think what helps is to really have use that purpose as your North Star, and then also be very clear on the values that are dear to any decision you make. And I think that kind of a value-based and purpose-driven approach certainly helps to clearly define boundaries in terms of how you make decisions and what you do and what you don't do. Obviously, that is still very vague, so you have to break it down also into clear, in a vision that it can communicate to the entire organization where you want to be and how to get there, so that people understand what does it take to get there, how can they involve themselves, regularly communicate on where you are in this process, because most transformations don't happen in a matter of months, but rather years. So it's important to regularly communicate where we are in the process and also readjust where need be. And since no change is easy, there will be situations where you wonder, are we still on the right track? And therefore, I find it very important to have, you call it a manifesto with your values in terms of how you make decisions, or with that clear North Star that guides you, and also what you do, what you develop, but a clear understanding also on how do you do, how do you want to work together, define this, including your teams to help in that dialogue and definition of how you want to work to get that done. And then if and that goes to both the leadership team as well to any employee of the organization, if you see behavior that goes against what you have defined, then you also need to very clearly address this. So it needs to be clear that there's no way of falling out of those principles.
Very interesting. Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. I mean, and also one thing I find interesting in these, not only in transformations, but in general in leadership, is especially these days, you don't tend to have, teams that are the same people from the same background, from the same everything. You tend to have quite diverse teams and cross-functional teams, and especially projects and programs. And of course, with a lot of diversity comes conflict sometimes, right? And comes different perspectives, and people disagree, and people see things differently. It's hard to find consensus and everything. How do you effectively lead cross-functional teams? Is there a right way for you?
What I find important is that the individual teams, they know how they contribute within their capacity, but also within a larger ambition, goal, or initiative. So again, you can break down a company purpose into like individual department purposes, and let's say, okay, this is the purpose of the company. What's the purpose of marketing to contribute to that bigger purpose? How do we provide value to the neighboring departments, product development, to sales? How can we make it easier for them? How can we help them to do a better job? How can we help support sales to do better in their interactions with customers? How can we bring insights to the table that help us to maybe shape our stories, our communication? How can we bring insights to the table that can help the product development team to incorporate, be it incremental innovations or entirely also look at new business models or new solutions, and that I think is something that requires continuous communication with the neighboring departments, workshops, and openness to reflect on also where did we F up, what didn't work, what can we do better if. What are things we need to stop doing? What are new things we should try out? And do this on a regular basis. Do this on a quarterly basis. Workshops where you go through those 3 questions. What should we stop doing? What should we continue doing? What are new things we want to try out for the next quarter? And I think if you instill that continuous reflection and continuous improvement, if you just do this 4 times a year, there's already four times improvement in the way you collaborate with other departments. And if you manage to install this in every single department, it's amazing what that can do, not just in terms of output, but also in terms of mindset change to open up, to be maybe a bit more tolerant towards failure. Or maybe even further to appreciate failures because you see it as a learning opportunity, not not as a, you know, as something to be ashamed of.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. So actually, I love the 3 questions, you know, quarterly workshop. I think,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it doesn't sound like much in a sense, but I think it's amazing how often we go so far and never reflect.
Mm-hmm.
And we just continue, you know, with our blinders on, and we just
Mm-hmm.
continue doing what works or what we think works, and never really reflect. And I love that. It's a great and kind of simple way of actually having that reflection in place. Now, there's one more question I wanted to ask you. You sort of
Mm-hmm.
like we're diving into it a little bit already in the beginning, but I still want to ask it because I find it one of the more interesting ones
Mm-hmm.
when I get to speak to people. And it's a little bit more in the out, you know, ways more into the future and a little bit more into the clouds. But you know, imagine yourself being 80 years old and you're looking
Mm-hmm.
back at your life. You're sitting in your rocking chair maybe, and looking back at your life and looking back at, you know, the world, how things have changed and how things around you have changed. At that moment when you look back, what is something that you would want to have or see changed?
Well, that's a difficult one. What would I want to have changed looking back?
Yeah.
I hope when I'm 80 that there won't be too many of the big regrets. So one of the bigger regrets I would definitely, try to avoid moving forward is to, you know, that you also enjoy the process, the way of getting where you're going. So, like, you know, in my case, I have like 2 young kids. My daughter's 3 years old, boy is 1 year old. So despite a lot of work and busy, all the craziness of business as a startup entrepreneur, always make time and find time to also enjoy your family and enjoy those precious moments that are, you know, they're gone in a second, and there's no way to get that back if you've lost it. You know, my previous corporate job, I commuted up to 3 hours in a day. You're never going to get time back. And, you know, that's probably something I hope that I can hold dear on a daily basis, to be aware of, you know, how precious time is, and just try to make the best out of every single day, both at work as well as in your private, you know, in family life.
You know, I resonate so much with that, having 2 kids by myself. And, it's interesting because sometimes I think we have this sensation that we can make up for time, but that just doesn't work. It just
Mm-hmm.
doesn't work because it's not the same time when they're a year old or 5 year old. You can't really make up. You can make up for time maybe, but not really for experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really, really beautiful one. And I just want to say, thank you for sharing that. Really, really appreciate it. And thanks for being here, Patrick, and sharing your story
Pleasure.
and diving into these topics. And thank you so much for doing that. Appreciate it.
A pleasure, Daniel. Thank you for having me. Thank you. It was a pleasure.